The envelope was tucked inside a box labeled Grandma Misc in blue Sharpie, buried under a stack of my grandmother's old recipe cards. In a storage unit my sister had rented 6 months earlier and never quite gotten around to unpacking. I almost didn't open it. I almost handed it straight to Renee, the way I'd been handing her things all afternoon, because that's what you do when you're helping your sister pack up a life she's been avoiding sorting through for years. But the handwriting stopped me. My grandmother's handwriting, small and slanted and unmistakably hers, even 5 years after she died. For Joe, please read when you're ready. I love you both so much. I sat down on an overturned moving box in that storage unit and opened it right there, because when you're ready had apparently already been 5 years in the making, and I didn't think I could survive waiting any longer than I already had without knowing. The first line nearly broke me on its own. My sweet Josie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I need you to know something before anyone else tells you their version of it. But it was the postscript, 3 pages later, that turned my grief into something colder and sharper. I don't think your sister understood what she had me sign that Tuesday, or maybe she did. Either way, please look out for each other, even when it's hard. Especially then. My grandmother had died 5 years ago. This letter had clearly been written in her final weeks. And somehow, it had spent every single day since sitting in a box that had passed through at least 2 moves, 1 storage unit, and as I would learn over the following months, my sister's very deliberate decision to make sure I never saw it. I remember the specific physical sensation of that moment more than almost anything else from the whole ordeal that followed, the concrete cold seeping through my jeans, the smell of cardboard and dust. The sound of Renee's voice calling from the next aisle over asking if I'd found anything worth keeping in Grandma's box. Completely unaware that I was holding something that would eventually unravel 5 years of a story she'd built and maintained with what I now understand was tremendous, exhausting effort. I didn't answer her right away. I sat there for what felt like a long time, reading the same paragraph over and over, trying to make the words mean something other than what they very clearly meant. Quick thing before I keep going, because I genuinely love reading these. Where are you watching from tonight, and what's the weather like where you are? Drop it below. I read every comment. Okay. Let me back up, because you need the full shape of what happened before you'll understand why finding that letter in a storage unit changed absolutely everything. My name is Joe Ellery. I'm 32. I work as a labor and delivery nurse in Grand Rapids. And for 5 years, I believed my grandmother had changed her mind about who should get her lake cottage at the very end of her life. I believed it because my sister told me she had, and because I loved my sister, and because grief makes you accept explanations you'd otherwise have questioned a lot harder. To understand what that letter actually undid, you need to understand what I thought I knew before I found it. My grandmother, Vivian Ellery, raised my sister Renee and me for large stretches of our childhood, back when our parents' marriage was falling apart in slow, exhausting installments, and neither of them had much bandwidth left over for 2 young daughters. Nana Vivian's cottage on Lake Leelanau in northern Michigan was the one constant across all of it. Summers there smelled like citronella candles and her rhubarb pie, and both Renee and I have decades of photographs of ourselves on that same dock, at every age, in swimsuits that got progressively less childish over the years. When Vivian was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2021, at 84, none of us expected much time. She was gone by that September, 5 months from diagnosis to funeral, most of it spent at a hospice facility in Traverse City, close enough for Renee, who lived in Ann Arbor at the time, to visit on weekends, and far enough from my job in Grand Rapids that I mostly saw her on the days I could arrange coverage, which was fewer than I wanted and more than I could really afford to take. Her will, drafted back in 2019 with a longtime family attorney named Arthur Delgado, split her estate evenly between Renee and me. The cottage, appraised at the time around $340,000, and a modest investment account with Edward Jones worth roughly $95,000. Simple, clean, exactly what you'd expect from a woman who'd spent her whole life trying not to play favorites between 2 granddaughters she loved with equal, fierce intensity. 2 weeks after the funeral, Renee sat me down at her kitchen table and told me something had changed near the very end. Nana, she said, had grown worried in her final weeks that splitting the cottage between 2 households would eventually force a sale neither of us wanted. That shared ownership of a property like that, once we both had our own families and our own competing schedules, would slowly tear it apart the way it had for so many other families they both knew. So Renee told me Nana had gone back to a lawyer in her final month and adjusted things. Renee would keep the cottage outright, since she and her husband Curtis were the ones who'd be nearby enough to maintain it, and I would receive a larger cash distribution from the investment account to balance things out, $42,000, roughly half the account, on top of a smaller cash gift she said Nana had specifically wanted me to have. I remember sitting there, hollowed out with grief, barely 3 weeks removed from watching my grandmother take her last breath, and simply nodding. It made a kind of sense in the fog I was in. Renee did live closer. Renee and Curtis had talked for years about eventually retiring somewhere near the lake. I didn't fight it. I didn't even really question it. I signed whatever needed signing, took my $42,000, and told myself I still had the cottage in the way that mattered. I could still visit, Renee said, anytime I wanted, no questions asked. I visited exactly 4 times in 5 years. Each time felt a little more like visiting someone else's house. Looking back now, there were small things about that kitchen table conversation that should have registered differently at the time. Renee had the paperwork already printed and organized in a folder before I arrived, everything tabbed and highlighted in the places I needed to sign, which felt, in the moment, like her being thoughtful and efficient during a hard time. She mentioned the new attorney only once, briefly, by first name. Grant handled the update. He's very thorough. And I never thought to ask his last name, or where his office was, or why my grandmother, a woman who'd used the same attorney for over a decade, would have switched to someone new in her final weeks of life. Grief doesn't make you a careful reader of other people. It makes you grateful for anyone willing to hold the logistics steady while you fall apart, and Renee, in that moment, was very good at looking like exactly that person. I read the rest of the letter sitting on that overturned moving box, and I want to walk you through what it actually said, because the details matter enormously to everything that happened afterward. My grandmother wrote that a man had come to see her on a Tuesday in late August 2021, about 3 weeks before she died, introduced by Renee as someone to help make sure everything's in order. She described feeling groggy that day. She'd had her pain medication adjusted the previous afternoon, something new added for breakthrough pain. And she wrote that she remembered signing papers but not really reading them, because the pain in her stomach that week had been bad enough that reading small print for more than a minute or two made her nauseated. I keep thinking about what I signed, she wrote. Renee says it's just an update to reflect wishes I told her about. I don't remember telling her those wishes, but my memory these days isn't what it used to be, and I don't want to make trouble over something that might just be me being confused. I do know one thing clearly, though, clearer than almost anything else right now. I always wanted the cottage to be for both of my girls. Not because you'd use it the same way, but because it was never mine to divide unevenly between 2 people I love exactly the same amount. If something got changed that doesn't reflect that, I need you to know it wasn't what I actually wanted, even if it's what I put my name to. She went on for 2 more pages, memories mostly, the kind of things grandmothers write in letters like this, funny stories about my childhood, a line about how proud she was of the nurse I'd become. But she closed with one more paragraph that I've read so many times since that I can recite it without looking. I don't know if this letter will matter by the time either of you reads it. Maybe everything will have sorted itself out and this will just be an old woman's confused worrying. But if it hasn't sorted itself out, if something feels unfair and you can't quite name why, I wanted you to have my actual words, not just whatever paper someone else put in front of me at the end. I sat in that storage unit for a long time after I finished reading, the cold concrete floor seeping through my jeans, trying to understand how a letter addressed specifically to me, describing exactly the situation I'd been living inside for 5 years, had never once made its way to me. Then I remembered Renee was 20 feet away, sorting through a different box, completely unaware of what I'd just found. I didn't confront her that day. I want to be honest about that because I think it says something about how disorienting the whole discovery was. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was a kind of protective secrecy of my own, an urge to get the letter somewhere safe and think clearly before I said anything I couldn't take back. I told Renee I needed to leave early, something about a shift swap I needed to sort out, and I drove home with the letter on the passenger seat like it might disappear if I stopped watching it. I read it 4 more times that night. I photographed every page with my phone, then photographed them again with better lighting, because some irrational part of me was already terrified of losing the only physical proof that this letter existed at all. The next morning, I called the one person who might be able to tell me whether any of this actually mattered, legally, 5 years after the fact. Arthur Delgado, the attorney who drafted Vivian's original 2019 will and who, as far as I knew, had never been involved in whatever amendments supposedly happened in her final weeks. Arthur remembered my grandmother well. He'd handled her affairs for over a decade. And when I explained what I'd found, and what Renee had told me 5 years earlier about an amended will, there was a long pause on the line that told me everything before he said a word. "Joe, I want to be very careful here because I haven't seen this document you're describing," he said. "But I can tell you that I never drafted any amendment to Vivian's will. If one exists, it wasn't done through my office, and given how closely I worked with her for years, I would have expected her to at least mention it to me, even informally, if she were genuinely considering a change like that. Do you know who might have drafted it if it wasn't you?" "I don't. But if it exists, it'll be a matter of public record, filed with the probate court when the estate went through administration. I can help you pull that if you want to see it for yourself." I did want to see it for myself. What I found 3 days later, sitting in the Grand Traverse County probate records, was a will dated August 24, 2021, 3 days after the visit my grandmother described in her letter, drafted and notarized by an attorney named Grant Osai, someone neither Arthur nor I had ever heard of, whose office was located not in Traverse City near my grandmother's hospice, but in Ann Arbor, a 5-hour drive away in the same city where my sister lived. I printed the amended will and sat with it next to the original 2019 document Arthur had emailed me, comparing them line by line at my own kitchen table that night. The language shift was subtle in places, jarring in others. The 2019 will describe the cottage bequest in warm, specific terms, a full paragraph about wanting both of my granddaughters to always have a place at the lake together the way I raised them. The 2021 amendment reduced that same bequest to a single clinical sentence. "The real property located at 4471 Shore Drive shall pass to Renee Ellery Marsh." Whoever drafted the second document either didn't know my grandmother well enough to write in her voice or didn't care to. I want to slow down here because this is the point where the story stopped being about a letter and started being about a pattern. And patterns are what finally convinced me I wasn't imagining a grievance where none existed. Grant Osai's law office, according to the State Bar Directory, was a solo practice specializing primarily in real estate closings, not estate planning. When I called, posing as a potential client interested in a will, his assistant told me he generally didn't take estate work anymore and hadn't for a couple years now. Which, when I did the math, meant he'd stopped taking exactly the kind of case that had produced my grandmother's amended will not long after producing it. I hired an estate litigation attorney of my own after that call, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Melissa Choi who'd been recommended by a coworker whose own family had gone through something similar. Melissa's first move was to request the complete probate file, including the notary log associated with the will's execution, which Michigan law requires notaries to maintain and in many cases to have available for review. The notary log took 3 weeks to obtain because Grant Osai's office initially claimed they couldn't locate it, a claim Melissa didn't accept for a second, and pushed back on with a formal records request that made clear the state's Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs would be the next call if the log didn't surface. It surfaced 12 days later. The entry for August 24, 2021 listed Vivian Ellery as the signer, my sister Renee as one of 2 required witnesses, and a second witness listed only as R. Marsh, my sister's married name, but not her own signature, which meant, as Melissa pointed out immediately, that my sister's husband Curtis had apparently served as the second witness to a document his own wife stood to benefit from directly. Michigan law doesn't strictly forbid an interested party from witnessing a will, but it does raise serious questions in a later challenge. And Melissa said she'd rarely seen a notary log that handed her a cleaner argument for undue influence on its own. There was one more detail in that log that made my stomach drop the first time I read it. Under location of signing, instead of the hospice facility's address, it read simply, "Private residence, Ann Arbor, MI." My grandmother had died in a hospice facility in Traverse City. She had not, as far as I or any of her hospice nurses could account for, ever left that facility in the final 6 weeks of her life. Whatever happened on August 24, 2021, had not happened where the notary log claimed it happened. Melissa asked the hospice facility for their visitor and departure logs from that week, something she said was a long shot given how many years had passed, but the facility, to my genuine surprise, still had them archived digitally. The log confirmed Vivian never left the building between her admission in July and her death in September. It also confirmed something else. On August 24, 2021, the visitor log showed exactly 2 names signing in that afternoon, Renee Ellery Marsh, and a name that hadn't appeared in the notary log at all. Grant Osei had, in fact, come to the hospice that day. Someone had simply written down the wrong location afterward, whether through carelessness or something closer to an attempt to make the paperwork look more polished and less rushed than it actually was. I confronted Renee 11 days after finding the letter, once Melissa had reviewed everything and told me I had enough, at minimum, to justify asking my sister directly before deciding what to do next. I drove to her house in Ann Arbor on a Sunday afternoon, the letter in a manila folder on the passenger seat again, and I sat across from her at the same kitchen table where she'd first told me 5 years earlier that Nana had changed her mind about the cottage. I put the letter in front of her without saying much of anything. I watched her read the first page, watched her face do something complicated and fast that she tried to smooth over before she got to the second page, and by the time she reached the postscript, her hands were shaking. "Where did you find this?" she said, not really a question. The same words, almost exactly, my mother's voice would have used if I'd told her about a different discovery entirely, a strange echo I only noticed later. "In the storage unit, in a box you packed. Renee, the notary log says this was signed at a private residence in Ann Arbor. Nana never left that hospice." She didn't deny it right away, which surprised me more than anything else that afternoon. She sat very still, staring at the letter, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost the composed, reasonable tone I'd grown used to hearing whenever the cottage came up. "Curtis's business was drowning that summer," she said. "The landscaping company? We were 2 missed mortgage payments away from losing our house, and I didn't know how to tell you that, because you'd just gotten your ICU certification and things were finally going well for you, and I didn't want to be the sister who was always falling apart. I told myself the cottage would be worth more to us if I could refinance against it later, and I told myself Nana would have wanted us to have that security. And somewhere in there I stopped being able to tell the difference between what she actually wanted and what I needed her to want." "So you brought a lawyer to her? Not to the hospice, to your house?" "I brought the papers to the hospice on the 24th, she said, and something in the specificity of that correction told me she'd rehearsed defending this exact accusation more than once in 5 years, even if she'd never had to say it out loud. Grant came with me, he notarized it there. I don't know why the log says private residence, maybe he made an error, maybe. Renee, Nana wrote that she was groggy that day, that she signed something without really reading it. That's not an error in a log, that's a description of what happened to her. She got up from the table and walked to the sink, ran the tap for no reason I could tell, just something to do with her hands. When she turned back around, her eyes were wet, but her voice had steadied into something more careful, like she was choosing each word with real deliberation now instead of just reacting. "You have to understand what those weeks were like for me," she said. "I was driving back and forth to Traverse City every weekend, watching her disappear a little more each visit, and at the same time Curtis was calling me every night telling me the bank was sending letters. I wasn't thinking straight either, Joe. I know that's not an excuse. I know I don't get to say I wasn't thinking straight about something I apparently thought straight enough to plan out with an attorney and drive 5 hours to arrange. I just need you to know it didn't feel like a plan while I was doing it. It felt like the only door I could see that was still open. Did you ever think about just telling her the truth? Asking her outright when she was lucid instead of catching her on a day she wasn't?" Renee didn't answer that question for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice had gone very quiet. "I was afraid she'd say no," she said. "And I don't think I could have survived hearing her say no to me at the end, when I'd already decided I needed this to be yes. I want to be fair to my sister here, the same way I've tried to be fair to everyone in this story, because I don't think what she did came from nowhere, and I don't think 5 minutes of anger at a kitchen table captures the whole shape of who she is. Renee had watched our parents' marriage collapse the same way I had, but she'd absorbed it differently. She was 3 years older, old enough to remember the version of our family before things fell apart. And I think some part of her spent the rest of her life terrified of instability, in a way I never quite developed the same fear of. Maybe because I was too young to remember what stability had even felt like in the first place. When Curtis's landscaping business started hemorrhaging money in 2021, on top of watching our grandmother die, I think Renee genuinely believed she was facing the exact kind of collapse she'd spent her whole adult life trying to outrun. That doesn't excuse what she did. I want to say that clearly because I know how these stories can sometimes drift into letting an antagonist off the hook simply by explaining them. Understanding why someone did something terrible isn't the same as deciding it wasn't terrible. But sitting across from her that Sunday, watching her finally say the truth out loud after 5 years of not saying it, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like I was watching my sister finally set down something that had clearly been crushing her the entire time she'd been carrying it alone. "Why didn't you just ask me for help?" I said. "If Curtis's business was in that much trouble, why go around Nana instead of just telling me?" "Because you would have said yes," Renee said, and it was the most honest thing she said that entire afternoon. "You would have found a way to help us, and I would have owed you something I could never fully pay back, and some part of me would rather have taken the cottage and felt guilty forever than asked my little sister to bail me out. I know how that sounds. I've had 5 years to know exactly how that sounds." I asked her, finally, about the letter, whether she'd found it before or after our conversation 5 years ago. Whether she'd known it existed when she sat me down and told me Nana had changed her mind. She told me she'd found it about 6 weeks after the funeral, going through Vivian's things at the cottage. Already deep into the story she'd built for me, already living inside the version of events that let her keep the house. She said she read it once, put it in a box, and told herself she'd deal with it later when things were less raw. Later became 5 years, 3 moves, and a storage unit she'd been quietly, deliberately avoiding unpacking because some part of her, I think, knew exactly what would happen the day someone else finally opened that box. Melissa Choi filed a petition to set aside the August 2021 amended will 6 weeks after that conversation, once she'd gathered enough supporting documentation to make the case properly rather than rushing it out of anger. Michigan probate law generally requires a will contest to be filed within a fairly narrow window after the will is admitted to probate, typically a matter of months, not years, which would have made this entire case dead on arrival if Melissa hadn't been able to argue something called fraudulent concealment. The theory, she explained to me carefully over coffee before we filed anything, was this. The standard contest window exists on the assumption that interested parties have access to the information they'd need to raise objections in a timely way. When a party actively conceals evidence relevant to a will's validity, in this case, a letter directly describing the testator's confusion and doubt about the very document being contested, courts can, in certain circumstances, toll that window until the concealed evidence is actually discovered. It's not a guaranteed win. It's an uphill argument. But the notary log's location discrepancy, combined with the letter itself, combined with Curtis serving as an interested witness, gave Melissa more to work with than she said she usually got in cases like this. We also brought in a geriatric physician, Dr. Ann Kowalski, as an expert witness to review Vivian's hospice medication records from the week of August 24, 2021. Her report, which took nearly 2 months to prepare, concluded that the combination of opioid dosing my grandmother had been on that week. Records confirmed a dosage increase 4 days before the signing. Exactly matching what Vivian described in her letter, was consistent with significant impairment to short-term memory and reading comprehension, particularly for dense legal language. Even if my grandmother had remained verbally coherent enough to answer simple questions and sign her name, Grant Osai, when Melissa's office subpoenaed him for a deposition, could not produce contemporaneous notes from the signing, could not fully explain the discrepancy in the notary log's listed location, and eventually testified under oath that he had limited independent recollection of the specific circumstances of that visit beyond what was in his file, which, notably, contained almost nothing beyond the signed will itself. The Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs opened its own inquiry into his notary practices after Melissa forwarded a copy of the log discrepancy, separate from our civil case, which was still pending the last I checked. Dr. Kowalski's deposition was, in some ways, the hardest afternoon of the entire process for me to sit through, harder even than confronting Renee. Listening to a stranger describe, in clinical, careful language, exactly what my grandmother's body and mind were likely experiencing in her final weeks. The confusion, the fatigue, the way opioid metabolism changes in a body that's actively shutting down, made her decline feel newly, freshly real in a way 5 years of grief had somehow allowed me to soften around the edges. I remember excusing myself afterward and sitting in Melissa's office bathroom for 10 minutes before I could compose myself enough to leave the building. I won't pretend the months that followed were anything other than exhausting, both for me and, in a different way, for Renee. Family gatherings stopped happening almost entirely. Our mother, who'd remarried and moved to Florida years earlier, tried at first to stay neutral, then eventually told me, gently but firmly, that she thought I should let this go for the sake of the family. A sentence that cost me a 2-week silence between us before I could bring myself to respond to her calmly. I had my own moments of doubt during that stretch, more than I expected to. There was a night in March, about 4 months into the legal process, where I sat in my car outside the courthouse after a particularly grueling deposition, and genuinely wondered whether I was destroying what was left of my family over a lake cottage. Whether my grandmother, wherever she was, would actually want this level of conflict over a piece of property, letter or no letter. I called Melissa that night, which I'd never done outside business hours before, and she said something that stuck with me. "You're not fighting over a cottage," she told me. "You're fighting because your grandmother trusted you to make sure her actual wishes mattered more than whatever was convenient for someone else. That's not the same thing, even if it looks the same on paper." Curtis, for his part, largely disappeared from the process. Melissa's office noted that his landscaping business had, in fact, gone through a formal restructuring in late 2021, consistent with what Renee had described, lending real financial substance to her stated motive even as it did nothing to excuse the method. He was deposed briefly about his role as a witness and admitted, uncomfortably, that he hadn't actually watched Vivian sign the document. He'd arrived afterward, at Renee's request, to add his signature to the witness line, which Melissa argued was itself a separate, fairly serious problem with the will's execution entirely apart from the location discrepancy. There was a particular week in April, right in the middle of discovery, that tested me more than almost any other stretch of this whole process. Our mother called to tell me Renee had been hospitalized briefly for what she described only as stress. And for 2 full days I sat with a version of guilt I hadn't expected, wondering whether the pressure of the lawsuit itself was doing damage that no amount of being right about the letter could justify. I called Melissa in tears that week, asking whether we should pause everything. She didn't tell me what to do, she just asked me one question: "If you drop this today, will you be at peace with the outcome in 10 years? I sat with that question for a long time before I had my answer, and the answer painfully was no. The probate court hearing on the petition to set aside the will was scheduled for late June, nearly 8 months after I'd first opened that envelope in the storage unit. Renee's attorney argued, as expected, that the discovery rule exception shouldn't apply, that Vivian's letter was ambiguous enough to be read as simple end-of-life anxiety rather than a genuine claim of incapacity or undue influence, and that 5 years of settled expectations shouldn't be unwound over a document that was, after all, just a letter, not a legal instrument. The judge, a probate court judge named Harriet Osai-Bonsu, no relation, as it turned out, to the notary, though I remember the coincidence of the surname making my stomach drop for one bad second before Melissa confirmed it, took the matter under advisement and issued her ruling 3 weeks later, in writing, rather than from the bench. The ruling set aside the August 24, 2021 amended will, finding sufficient evidence of both procedural irregularity in its execution and reasonable grounds to question my grandmother's capacity at the time of signing, particularly given the medication records and the unexplained discrepancy in the notary log's stated location. The court reinstated the original 2019 will as the operative document, which meant, on paper, that the cottage and the remaining investment account were to be redistributed according to Vivian's original, equal intentions. But on paper and in practice turned out to be 2 very different things, because 5 years is a long time, and money doesn't sit still waiting for a court to sort out what should have happened to it. Renee and Curtis had, in the interim, invested roughly $60,000 of their own money into repairs and updates to the cottage. A new roof, an updated septic system, work that genuinely needed doing and that I couldn't in good conscience pretend hadn't added real value. Neither of us had anywhere close to the resources to simply buy the other out of a $340,000 property, especially once you accounted for what it was worth now, closer to $410,000 after those improvements and 5 years of a hot lake property market. What we ended up with, after another 2 months of negotiation through our respective attorneys, wasn't a clean, triumphant reclaiming of what had been taken from me. It was a settlement. The cottage would be sold, the proceeds split according to the original will's 50-50 terms after reimbursing Renee and Curtis for the documented value of their improvements, and the remaining investment account, which had grown slightly over 5 years to about $102,000, would likewise be split evenly, with the $42,000 I'd already received 5 years earlier deducted from my share. I cried the day the cottage sold, standing on that same dock one last time, in a way I hadn't let myself cry through any of the legal proceedings that came before it. Not because of the money. By the time everything settled, after legal fees on both sides, the actual financial difference to my life was meaningful but not life-altering, somewhere in the range of an extra $95,000 I wouldn't have had otherwise. I cried because the place where I'd learned to swim, where my grandmother had taught me to bait a hook with more patience than I deserved as a fidgety 8-year-old, was going to belong to strangers, regardless of who technically won the legal argument about who it should have belonged to instead. The buyers, a retired couple from Chicago, asked if I wanted to walk through one more time before closing, and I said yes before I'd really thought it through. Standing in the kitchen where Vivian used to roll out pie dough, I found myself telling the wife, a woman named Carol I'd never met before that afternoon, a completely unnecessary amount about my grandmother, the way she hummed while she cooked, the specific rhubarb patch out back that Carol promised, unprompted, she intended to keep tending. It wasn't closure exactly, but it was something adjacent to it, a small mercy I hadn't expected the day to offer. Renee and I don't talk often now. We're not estranged, exactly. We exchange birthday texts. We were both at our mother's 60th last spring, seated at the same table without incident. But the easy, assumed closeness we had before any of this is gone, and I don't know if it's coming back or if it's supposed to. I've thought a lot about whether I'd do it differently, knowing everything I know now about what the process would cost. Not just financially, though the legal fees on both sides likely ran close to $70,000 combined, but in the quieter cost of a family that used to gather without tension and now mostly doesn't gather at all. I keep landing in the same place. I don't think I could have read that letter and simply put it back in the box. Once I knew what my grandmother had actually wanted, pretending I didn't know felt like its own kind of theft, even if the theft in question would have only ever been from myself. I think about Renee's reasoning more than I expected to in the year since the settlement. I don't think she's a villain in the way these stories sometimes want their antagonists to be. I think she's someone who made one very serious decision under enormous financial pressure, at the worst possible moment, and then spent 5 years too afraid to undo it, watching the fear compound the way debts do when you refuse to look at them directly. I don't excuse it. I do understand it, and those two things have learned slowly to sit next to each other in my head without canceling each other out. The strangest part of all of this, if I'm honest, is that I don't think Renee even ended up better off for what she did. She has the money from the cottage sale, same as I do. Curtis's business stabilized on its own eventually, mostly unrelated to any of this. What she lost, the version of our relationship where I trusted her completely, the version of herself, I suspect, that could look at our grandmother's photo without flinching a little, wasn't something the settlement could give back to her, or to either of us. I think, too, about the notary Grant Osei, whose licensing inquiry was still ongoing the last time Melissa checked in with me. I don't feel triumphant about that either. He made a serious professional failure. Whatever combination of carelessness and willingness to look the other way led him to backdate or misstate a signing location for a family under obvious financial strain, and there should be consequences for that. But I also think about how many quiet, desperate arrangements probably move through offices like his every year, small enough on their own to never make headlines, each one changing the shape of some other family's next 5 years the way this one changed ours. I keep my grandmother's letter in a fireproof lockbox now, alongside the photographs from that lockbox, of both of us on that dock, at every age, going back to when Renee still had her front baby teeth, and I was barely old enough to stand upright in the shallow water without holding someone's hand. I've read the letter more times than I could count at this point, but there's one line I come back to more than any other, one I didn't fully understand the weight of the first time I read it sitting on a cold storage unit floor. If it hasn't sorted itself out, if something feels unfair and you can't quite name why, I wanted you to have my actual words, not just whatever paper someone else put in front of me at the end. My grandmother, dying, confused, on medication that blurred whole afternoons together, still found the clarity to understand that whatever she was being asked to sign might not survive contact with the truth. She left me a version of herself that no notary log or rushed legal document could overwrite, and it took 5 years sitting in a box for it to finally do the work she'd intended it to do. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've tried hard not to force one, I think it's this. The people we love most are capable of decisions we'd never expect from them, when they're frightened enough and desperate enough and convinced, even briefly, that the alternative is losing everything. That doesn't make those decisions forgivable on its own, but it makes them human, in a way that flat, easy villainy never quite is, and I've found more peace holding both of those truths together than I ever found in the anger alone. I don't visit Lake Leelanau anymore. The new owners repainted the dock a color my grandmother never would have chosen, and I've made my peace with not going back to see it. What I have instead is a letter, 4 pages long, in handwriting I'd know anywhere. That reminds me every time I read it that the truest version of the people we love isn't always the one that makes it into the official paperwork. Sometimes it's just sitting quietly in an old cookbook box, waiting for someone to finally be ready to find it. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals, families, or events is coincidental. If this story resonated with you, the takeaway is simple. The truth doesn't expire just because it's been buried for years, it just waits for someone willing to keep looking.